In the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation as the black woman stood at the front of the room, her posture straight and dignified, eyes fixed ahead, her expression calm yet steely. There was no hint of nerves, despite the fact that everyone else in the room seemed on edge. Whispers bounced from one person to another as they tried to make sense of the woman who had just entered through the door, dressed in a crisp business suit that seemed out of place for the nature of the charge she was about to face. But no one knew what she had truly come here for. To them, she was just another person caught in the web of minor traffic violations and legal formalities, a small matter for the court that would be handled quickly and efficiently. Like every other case, the white judge behind the bench sat high in his chair, his hands resting on the papers in front of him, not paying attention to the woman in particular, his eyes scanning over the details of the case before him. Yet his thoughts were already drifting elsewhere. He was used to these kinds of cases where time was money and patience ran thin. His job was simple. He had heard this type of case thousands of times over the years, and the outcome was always predictable: an easy fine for someone who had broken a minor rule of the road. The judge had already decided how things would unfold, and as the woman stood before him, he made no effort to hide his disinterest. His eyes barely looked up from the papers as he began to read aloud the charges against her. The woman had been cited for running a red light, an infraction that many would have found laughable. She seemed out of place for the typical defendant facing such a charge. But to the judge, it was another day, another case, another fine that would be paid with no questions asked. He cleared his throat and started to issue the fine when the woman's voice interrupted him. It was calm and composed, but something in her tone made him pause. She didn't ask for mercy, nor did she offer excuses. She simply asked for a moment to speak. Her request was polite yet firm. There was no trembling in her voice, no sign of fear, just an overwhelming sense of self-assurance. The judge narrowed his eyes, slightly irritated, but nodded for her to proceed, his mind already drifting back to the paperwork he had before him and the next case he would need to address. She took a breath and began to speak about how she had been caught up in a moment of distraction, an unfortunate but harmless mistake. She explained she had not meant to break the law and had every intention of paying the fine in full. But there was more to her story. She was not just any ordinary woman who had committed a simple infraction. No, she was a person of influence, a person whose decisions affected millions of lives across the country, a leader who had been silently working behind the scenes to implement sweeping changes to federal social welfare systems that many people would never even know existed. It was a story that no one in the courtroom expected, and certainly not the judge, who was still gazing at the woman with a quiet disbelief. His mind was slow to catch up with her words as she continued to speak with a level of professionalism that far surpassed the setting of a small traffic court. She spoke not just as a defendant, but as someone with a mission, someone who had a purpose far beyond the walls of this courtroom. But still he did not seem to understand the significance of what she was saying. As the woman spoke, the judge shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes briefly flickering up from the paperwork to take in her words. But his mind was still focused on the task at hand. He had heard countless people make excuses or attempt to explain away their actions, but this woman was different. Her voice was unwavering, and her words carried a weight that he hadn't anticipated. She wasn't pleading for mercy or offering a sob story. She was simply stating facts, and in the process she had captured the full attention of everyone in the courtroom. A few of the audience members were now leaning forward, as if sensing something was different about this case. The court clerk, who had been quietly working behind the scenes, suddenly looked up and exchanged a brief glance with the judge, a subtle exchange that would have gone unnoticed by most, but it was enough to make the judge's brow furrow slightly. The clerk's face was pale, and there was a sense of urgency in his eyes. Something was wrong, and the judge could feel it in his gut, yet he still didn't fully understand what was happening. As the woman continued to explain her involvement in the federal welfare reform programs, the judge finally allowed himself to fully listen to her words. She was talking about programs that he had heard of, but had never paid much attention to. They were part of the bureaucracy he didn't care to dive into. His world was small and contained, focused on enforcing the law as it appeared before him, nothing more. But as she spoke, something clicked in his mind, a realization that stunned him to the core. This wasn't just any ordinary woman in front of him. She wasn't some random defendant. She was someone who had the power to change the course of national policy, someone whose decisions impacted millions of lives across the country. And that was a fact that he had been blind to until this very moment. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the woman finished her explanation. And there was a brief pause before the judge spoke. His voice was different now, less detached and more focused. His tone had shifted from the usual disinterest to one of cautious respect. He cleared his throat and looked down at his notes, his mind racing as he tried to reconcile the woman standing before him with the minor violation. She was being charged with everything about the situation felt wrong to him, in a way he couldn't quite put into words. He had seen so many people pass through his court over the years, but none had made such an impression as this woman. Her poise, her authority, and the sheer importance of the work she was doing made her presence in this courtroom almost surreal. It was as though she didn't belong here, not because of the nature of the charge, but because of who she was and what she represented. And as the weight of that realization settled over him, the judge knew he had to do something different, something more than simply impose a fine on her. But he was unsure of what step to take next. He wasn't used to feeling this conflicted in his own courtroom. But this woman had forced him to confront something much bigger than a simple traffic violation. It was a question of fairness and understanding, a recognition that sometimes the people standing before him were far more than they appeared. And sometimes the system he upheld needed to be questioned itself. The judge sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. As he tried to process everything that had just unfolded, he had been trained to be objective, to follow the law, with no room for personal judgment or emotion. But this woman was challenging that belief in a way he couldn't ignore for the first time in a long while. He felt the weight of his own decisions, the burden of a system that was often blind to the complexities of real life. He glanced down at the papers in front of him. The fine that he had been about to issue seemed so small now, compared to the woman's testimony. He had already decided in his mind what he thought was just, but now he wasn't sure. His hand hovered over the gavel as he tried to find the right words, but nothing came to mind. The courtroom remained silent, as if everyone was waiting for him to make his move. But the judge was frozen. The clerk who had spoken to him earlier cleared his throat and leaned in closer, a quiet whisper breaking the tension. The words were simple but urgent. "Judge, she's the one behind the new federal welfare reforms, you know, the ones that've been making headlines lately." The judge's heart skipped a beat, and his stomach dropped as the words hit him like a hammer. He had heard about the reforms in passing, of course, but he had never stopped to consider who was actually behind them. And now that he knew the woman in front of him was the one steering those monumental changes, he felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. For the first time, he realized that this wasn't just about a minor violation anymore. This was about something much bigger, something that extended far beyond the courtroom and into the lives of thousands, if not millions of people. The realization was both humbling and terrifying. The judge took a deep breath as the pieces began to fall into place. The woman's calm demeanor, her sense of purpose, her unshakable confidence, it all made sense now. She wasn't just another defendant, she was a key player in a much larger game. And here he was about to treat her like just another statistic in a system that often failed to recognize the real impact of people's actions. For the first time, he wondered how many other moments like this had slipped through the cracks, how many other people with far-reaching influence had been overlooked or dismissed because they didn't fit into the neat little box that the court system had created. The judge looked up at the woman, her eyes still fixed on him, her expression unchanged, waiting for him to speak. He could feel her presence like a force in the room, and for a moment he felt small under the weight of her gaze. He cleared his throat and finally spoke. His voice was steadier now, but still filled with a sense of hesitation. He asked her about the reforms, the ones she had mentioned earlier, and what exactly they entailed, as if to buy himself time. But the truth was, he needed to understand who she was. He needed to understand how someone like her could find herself in his courtroom, facing a minor charge that now seemed so trivial in comparison to her life's work. The woman's response was measured and precise, her words flowing with the ease of someone who had explained these concepts countless times before. Yet there was a sense of urgency behind her calm demeanor. As she spoke of the programs she had helped shape, the welfare reforms were sweeping and ambitious, aiming to overhaul outdated systems that had left millions in need of support. without the resources they required. She spoke of poverty reduction initiatives, mental health programs, job retraining projects, and access to quality healthcare, all designed to create long-lasting change across the nation. Her voice carried the weight of the lives that depended on these reforms. But there was also a quiet determination in her tone, as though she knew that the work she was doing would continue long after this moment. In the courtroom, she explained that her role was not just to guide policy, but to actively engage with the communities most affected to understand their needs and create solutions that would truly make a difference. The judge listened intently as she spoke, but his mind was still reeling from the shock of the revelation. He had only just begun to grasp the full scale of her influence and the responsibility she carried with her every day. She wasn't just any public servant. She was a leader shaping the very foundation of the country's welfare system. And here she was standing in front of him for something as mundane as a traffic violation. His thoughts were muddled with conflicting emotions as he tried to reconcile the woman he had just learned about with the case he had initially been prepared to handle like any other. It was as though the room had shifted around him, and he couldn't quite find his footing. He glanced over at the clerk, who had been the first to whisper the information into his ear. But the clerk's face was now unreadable, as if he too understood the gravity of the situation, yet neither of them knew exactly how to navigate it. The judge cleared his throat once more and glanced down at his papers. His hands shook slightly as he picked up the fine slip, and for the first time questioned whether it should even be issued at all. He had spent years issuing fines to people who had broken the law without giving it a second thought, but now he was confronted with the reality that this woman wasn't just another name on a piece of paper. She was a force in her own right, someone whose work had the power to transform lives in ways that he couldn't even begin to understand. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, waiting for him to make a decision. The tension in the air was palpable, and for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure what to do. His mind raced through possibilities, but none of them seemed right. He couldn't just issue a fine and move on as he had done countless times before. It felt wrong. He felt wrong, as if he was failing to recognize the true significance of this moment. The weight of her presence in this courtroom was undeniable, and as she stood there waiting for his judgment, he knew that he couldn't treat her like everyone else. He couldn't let her walk out of this room with nothing more than a fine for a simple mistake. The judge let out a long breath and looked up at her with a new understanding in his eyes. The judge's eyes met hers, and for a moment there was silence, a heavy silence, as he struggled to find the words that would somehow match the gravity of the situation. He had only just begun to understand the sheer magnitude of what was at stake here. This wasn't a routine case anymore. The woman standing before him wasn't just another person who had slipped up on the road. She was a woman who held the future of countless individuals in her hands. Her role in shaping the country's welfare system was nothing short of revolutionary. And yet here she was facing the consequences of something so trivial in the grand scheme of things. The judge felt a deep sense of discomfort. It wasn't just about her work or her influence. It was about the system. He upheld the system that had allowed this moment to unfold in such a way. How many other instances had there been where the law had failed to recognize the full picture? He wasn't sure, but this one felt different. It felt like an oversight, an injustice, even though there was no malice in the law's intent. But something about this moment had illuminated the flaws in the way he had always viewed his role. He wasn't just enforcing rules, he was perpetuating a system that could sometimes miss the bigger truths that lay beyond the surface. He looked at the woman again, her face still calm and poised, but now with a glint of curiosity in her eyes. She was waiting for him to speak, waiting for him to make the next move. But the judge wasn't sure he could move forward with what had been planned. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come out. He cleared his throat and tried again, but this time his voice was filled with uncertainty. He asked her about the welfare reforms again, this time wanting to understand more about her work, wanting to truly grasp what kind of difference she was making in the world. As she spoke this time, her words were even more passionate and clear. She described how the reforms aimed to shift the focus from temporary assistance to long-term empowerment. She spoke of giving people the tools to create sustainable livelihoods, not just handouts, but real opportunities for growth. She told him about the partnerships being forged with local organizations and businesses that would provide job training, affordable housing, and access to mental health services. Her vision for the future was one where the cycle of poverty could be broken, where people weren't just surviving, but thriving. She didn't boast about her accomplishments or demand recognition for her work. She simply explained the mission as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But to the judge it felt like a call to action. He realized that in the face of everything she was doing to reshape the very systems that govern people's lives, a minor traffic violation seemed utterly insignificant, yet he couldn't ignore it entirely. There was a part of him that still clung to the idea that justice had to be served in some way, and yet as he listened to her speak, he couldn't bring himself to proceed with the fine that had been his first instinct. He wasn't sure what to do next or how to handle the situation. He had never been faced with something like this before, but he knew deep down that this wasn't just about the law anymore. This was about recognizing the humanity and the power that lay within the woman standing before him. The judge leaned forward slightly, his voice softer now, as he asked her what her next steps were, what she planned to do with the reforms, and how he could support her work in some small way. The woman's eyes softened as she heard the judge's question. She hadn't expected him to ask about her work or show any real interest in it. But there it was, a shift in the air, a shift in him. She could see that the judge was beginning to understand the weight of the moment. As she spoke, she didn't let the opportunity go to waste. Her words were measured yet hopeful. As she described the broader vision behind the reforms, the plans to implement the changes were already in motion. But there was still so much work to be done. The government needed to continue working with local communities to gather feedback and adapt the programs to meet real needs. It wasn't a one-size-fits-all solution. And she made sure to emphasize that the most important part of the work was the people at the heart of it all. She spoke of the need for education, advocacy, and partnerships with organizations that could provide sustainable support. She made it clear that it wasn't just a matter of policy, but of changing lives, of making sure that every person had the resources to pull themselves up out of poverty, not just for a year or two, but for a lifetime. The judge could feel the passion in her voice and the sincerity behind every word. It was as though she was painting a picture of a better future, one where people weren't bound by circumstances they couldn't control, one where opportunity was not just a luxury, but a right. The more she spoke, the more he realized that the scope of her efforts was far beyond anything he could have imagined. Her influence stretched across the country, affecting millions in ways that weren't always visible, but were deeply felt in the lives of the people who were benefiting from her work. It was humbling to think about how this woman was able to change the systems that so often overlooked the very people they were meant to help. The judge began to feel a sense of responsibility, not just to her, but to the larger question at hand. He wasn't just a figure enforcing the law. He was part of a system that needed to see the bigger picture. He couldn't ignore the reality that the law had to evolve too, that it had to be willing to understand the full context of a situation before making judgments. As he sat there, absorbing everything she was saying, he felt a sense of humility settle over him. For the first time in a long time, he was truly listening and truly seeing the impact of her work on a much grander scale. He realized that the fine he had been about to issue seemed out of place entirely in this moment. This woman wasn't a criminal. She was a force of change, and if anything, he owed her the recognition she deserved. But still there was the question of what he would do with the fine. The judge's hands trembled slightly as he looked at the papers again. This time they seemed distant, disconnected from the reality in front of him. He could feel the weight of his decision pressing on him. What could he do to acknowledge the importance of what she was doing without undermining the authority of the court? But at the same time, how could he ignore the fact that she was here for something as trivial as a minor infraction, something that had no bearing on her life's mission and work? As the silence grew between them, the judge finally made a decision. He lifted his gaze back to the woman, and in a voice that was both firm and respectful, he spoke. The judge took a deep breath as he looked at the woman standing before him. His fingers hovered over the fine slip, and for a moment he felt the full weight of the moment settle upon him. He had been trained to be impartial, to treat everyone equally regardless of their status or influence. But this was different. This woman was not just another defendant. She was a leader shaping the future of social welfare across the nation. And here he was about to impose a fine for a minor infraction, a moment of lapse in judgment that in the grand scheme of things seemed almost laughable. Compared to the work she was doing, he knew he couldn't simply ignore the law. He couldn't just dismiss the charge because of her position, but at the same time he realized that issuing the fine would feel wrong. It would feel like a slap in the face to everything she was striving to accomplish. It would feel like the court system was incapable of seeing the bigger picture. He cleared his throat and looked up at her, his voice steady, but filled with a new sense of respect. He began by acknowledging the work she had described to him, her role in the federal welfare reforms, her dedication to creating lasting change for the people who needed it the most. He made it clear that he understood the importance of her work and that he appreciated the impact she was having across the country. He paused for a moment as he let the words sink in, and then he continued, but despite the respect he had for her mission, and despite the undeniable significance of what she was doing, he reminded her that the court still had a responsibility to uphold the law. He spoke about the importance of ensuring that everyone was held accountable for their actions regardless of their position or influence, and how the law must be applied equally to all people even if the circumstances might seem unusual or out of place. He explained that he had to make a decision based on the case in front of him, and that while he respected her work and her intentions, the fine still had to be issued. He could feel the tension in the room as he spoke. The judge had hoped for a clear path forward, but it was becoming more and more apparent that there was no simple answer, no easy way to navigate this situation. The courtroom held its collective breath, waiting for her response. She stood silently, her eyes never leaving his face. As she processed what he had said, there was no anger or frustration in her expression, just a quiet understanding. She knew that the judge was doing his job, that he had to maintain the integrity of the legal process, and in some ways she respected that she didn't expect him to bend the rules for her. But there was something about the way he had spoken to her that made her realize he saw her, he saw the bigger picture, and he wasn't just blindly going through the motions. It was a small victory in itself to be seen in such a way. She nodded slowly and spoke with a calm confidence, thanking him for his understanding, but also reminding him that her role in the reform work wasn't just about policies. It was about people, real lives that were impacted by the decisions they made in rooms like this. She didn't ask for leniency, nor did she expect it, but she made it clear that the work she was doing was for everyone, the ones who had no voice, and the ones who were often forgotten by the system. The judge felt the weight of her words settle over him like a mantle. Her message was clear. It wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about understanding how that law affected the very people who stood in his courtroom. The judge listened to her words carefully, and as they settled into his mind, he realized how much they had resonated with him. He had spent so much of his career focused on the black and white nature of the law and the need for clear boundaries. But here was a woman asking him to see beyond the surface, to look at the nuances and complexities that couldn't always be captured in a legal code. It was a lesson he had never expected to learn in this setting, in this place, but one he would not soon forget. He sat there in silence for a long moment as the courtroom waited for him to respond. The tension was palpable, but in that moment he was no longer concerned with what the law required him to do. He was concerned with what was right and what he would feel comfortable with when he left this room. He glanced down at the papers in front of him again, but this time they felt insignificant, like a formality he had to work through rather than a binding decision that determined someone's fate. He finally looked up at the woman, once more, his gaze steady, but with something different in his eyes. It was understanding, or perhaps an acknowledgement of something much deeper than the case in front of him. He cleared his throat and spoke, his voice more measured than before. He told her that he would issue a warning. Instead of the fine this time, he would make an exception, acknowledging her role in shaping the country's welfare policies and the importance of the work she was doing. He explained that the court could not afford to ignore the law, but that sometimes the law needed to be understood within a greater context, and that context was what had led him to this decision. He hoped she understood that his decision wasn't about letting her off the hook. It was about recognizing the larger picture and the way her work reflected on the lives of millions of people. He also made it clear that he wasn't doing this for personal reasons or because of the respect he had for her accomplishments. He was doing it because he had come to realize that the law needed to evolve to reflect the realities of the world outside the courtroom. The woman's expression softened as she listened to his decision. She hadn't expected a fine to be waived entirely. but she also hadn't expected to be treated with the kind of thoughtfulness and consideration the judge had shown her in this moment. She could see that he was grappling with something larger than a simple legal judgment. He was grappling with the realization that the law wasn't always just, and that sometimes it took an act of awareness to correct its course. She nodded, slowly acknowledging his decision with a quiet grace. She thanked him for his understanding and for taking the time to listen to her story. Her words were sincere, but there was something more in her eyes. It wasn't gratitude in the traditional sense. It was the understanding that this moment was a turning point, not just for her, but for the system itself. The judge looked at her and felt a deep sense of humility. As she left the courtroom, he realized that this case would stay with him for a long time, long after the courthouse doors had closed and the bustle of the day returned to normal. He knew that he would carry the lessons from this moment with him as he moved forward in his work. And perhaps most importantly, he understood now that true justice wasn't about rigidly enforcing the law, but about understanding how the law affected the lives of those who stood before it. As the woman walked out of the courtroom, the judge sat there for a long time in his chair, staring at the papers in front of him, his hands now resting loosely by his sides. He had never felt quite like this before. He had made decisions based on the law for years, without a second thought. But today had been different. Today had been a reminder that sometimes the law needed to be looked at through a broader lens. He thought about the woman's words, how she had explained her role in the reforms, how she had worked tirelessly to shift systems that had left so many behind, how her mission was not just about policy, but about giving real people real opportunities to live better lives. It wasn't just about numbers and statistics. It was about families and communities struggling to survive. And here he was issuing a fine for something that seemed so trivial compared to the weight of her work. He felt uneasy now about the many cases he had handled throughout his career, cases where he had never asked the deeper questions, never looked beyond the surface of what was presented to him. How many other people had stood before him in similar situations? How many had been reduced to simple cases of rule-breaking, without their stories ever being heard? He wondered if there had been others like her, others whose influence and importance hadn't been fully recognized because they didn't fit the mold of a typical defendant, or because they didn't seem to fit into the system in any meaningful way. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how easy it was to fall into a routine and treat people as if they were just another case to be processed through the system, without ever considering the real impact of their actions. He knew now that it wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about seeing the humanity in each person who came before him and understanding how their lives were shaped by forces beyond their control. He thought about the way she had held herself in the courtroom with such quiet strength, and how she had never asked for special treatment, how she had simply spoken her truth and allowed him to see it. He couldn't help but admire her for that. She had come into the courtroom not as someone who expected to be treated differently, but as someone who knew the value of her work and was willing to stand behind it, even in the face of what seemed like an insignificant issue. He wondered how many people in similar situations would have been able to do the same, how many would have simply accepted the fine and walked out without challenging the system that had created the circumstances in the first place. The judge leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about the implications of this day and how it might change the way he approached his work moving forward. He thought about the importance of looking beyond the surface and asking the difficult questions that might not always have easy answers, but that would lead to a deeper understanding of justice and fairness. He had always believed in the law, but now he realized that true justice was not just about applying rules and regulations. It was about understanding the full context of each case and ensuring that the law served the people who lived under it, rather than simply imposing consequences for their actions without regard to the bigger picture. The judge opened his eyes and stood up from his desk. He felt a quiet sense of resolve settle over him. He didn't know what the future would hold or how this change in his thinking would manifest, but he knew one thing for sure: he would never look at his job the same way again. The judge walked out of his office and into the hallway, feeling a strange weightlessness that he hadn't experienced before. It was as if the air around him had shifted, and he was seeing the world through a new lens. He passed by the courthouse staff and the familiar faces that he had seen countless times before, but today they felt different too. He no longer saw them as just people carrying out their roles, but as individuals who were part of a larger system that needed constant reflection and adjustment. He thought about how many times he had made snap judgments in the past, how many cases he had processed without truly considering the circumstances behind them, and how many voices had been lost in the shuffle, how many lives had been impacted by decisions that were made without a full understanding of their stories. He realized that his job was not just about upholding the law, it was about being an active participant in the justice system, one that was meant to protect and serve everyone, not just those who fit neatly into its framework. He knew that this shift in perspective wouldn't be easy. It would take time and conscious effort to change the way he approached each case. But he was determined to try. He had always believed in the importance of justice. But now he understood that it wasn't just about following the rules. It was about recognizing the humanity behind every case. The people who stood before him were not just numbers or statistics. They were human beings with stories and struggles that often went unnoticed. He walked down the steps of the courthouse and into the street as the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light over everything around him. He felt a sense of peace wash over him. As he looked at the world beyond the courthouse walls, he realized that while the law was necessary, it couldn't be the only thing that guided his decisions. It had to be accompanied by empathy and an understanding of the broader context in which people lived. He thought about the woman who had stood before him in court, and how she had left an imprint on him. She hadn't demanded change or special treatment, but she had quietly asked him to see her for who she was and to understand the work she was doing, and in doing so she had shown him a different way to approach justice, one that wasn't rigid or impersonal, but one that acknowledged the complexities of life and the need for a more compassionate and fair system. He took a deep breath and smiled to himself, knowing that he would carry this lesson with him every day moving forward. He didn't know exactly what changes would come, but he was certain that this was the beginning of a new chapter for him, and for the way he viewed his role in the justice system. He knew that it would be difficult to shift the way the court operated, but he also knew that he couldn't ignore the lessons he had learned today. The stories and struggles that lay behind every case needed to be heard and considered if true justice was to be served. As he walked home that evening, the weight of the day stayed with him, but it was no longer heavy. It was purposeful. It was a reminder that even in the most ordinary moments, life had the power to teach him something extraordinary, and he was ready to learn it.